Hello and welcome to lesson 7, differential association theory. Although this is under psychological explanations, this is technically a sociological explanation of crime, but you'll see where the psychological elements come in. So you need to know differential association theory. So far though, let's recap. We've looked at biology, how people like Lombroso believed that certain people were evolutionary throwbacks and they were criminals. We looked at biological models such as genetics, heredity, how criminality seems to run in families, how twins are more likely to be criminals if the other twin is also a criminal, neural and hormonal explanations. We've looked at personality and we've looked at moral development and cognitive biases. So today we're going to look at differential association, which, although it's a sociological theory, has key social learning elements. This theory was proposed by Edwin Sutherland in 1939. Now, Sutherland believed that merely by associating with criminals would make us more likely to become criminals. So there's a lot of operant and social learning theory involved in that, operant conditioning and social learning theory. He even attempted to develop a formula that would actually predict criminal behaviour. And chiefly we can see some of his work at play in things like gangs. So what is learned and how is it learned? Well, Sutherland argues that we learn things like the desirability of crime. How desirable is it to attain the things that you want through criminal acts? Attitudes towards crime, are they pro or are they against? Certain types of crime in particular communities may be valued, whereas other types may be abhorred. And growing up in the environment that I did, desirability of certain crimes was high, and those who committed them were respected. Things as well, how's it learned? Well, it's learned through frequency, length of interaction, and personal meaning of the association. So what do you mean by these? Frequency is how often do you come into contact with these criminal groups or individuals. Length of time is obviously how long do you spend in their presence. And personal meaning of those associations. Are they someone you admire? Are they someone that you care about, that you work with, that you look up to, that perhaps you're related to, perhaps you want to form a relationship with? These will all shape your criminal attitudes. It can also occur through direct and indirect learning, so operant conditioning and vicarious reinforcement. And bear in mind that this is at a time long before Bandura's principles of social learning theory have been developed. So he's really a pioneer in this field. But what we're talking about is direct rewards, someone initiating you into a gang and rewarding you with praise or with money or some sort of other valuable commodity, or indirect learning, the feeling of belongingness, or witnessing someone else engaging in crime and being praised for it and wanting some of that for yourself. There's a lot of this in American gang culture, where the desire to be the biggest and the baddest is a form of indirect learning. Because if you're top dog on the mean streets of Chicago, for example, you get a lot of respect from those around you, and you may desire that, so you behave in a way in accordance. The reward may come from family, and modelling is a key part. And again, I can't stress how pioneering this idea is, given how far before Bandura it really was. But the idea of having role models, who are these individuals who commit crimes that are looked up to and admired. There were people who genuinely admired the Cray twins. These vicious psychopaths who murdered scores of people. There were people who looked up to them. And even growing up in the working class community that I did, where there were a lot of Cockneys who came to that part of Essex, they would say things like, they weren't all bad. They loved their mum, for example, as though that's some admirable trait that wiped the slate clean. But modelling is a key part of this. So who is it learned from? It's learned from peers, family members, and the wider neighbourhood attitude generally. The degree to which local community supports or opposes crime affects it. And differential social organisation determines the differences in crime rates from one area to another. So the idea is if you live in a pro-crime area, crime will be higher. If you live in a anti-crime area, crime will be lower. And you can look at two case studies here. You can look at the fox hunting protests, which were largely peaceful, and compare them to the Tottenham riots, where people set fire to cars and McDonald's and shoe stores. These were two very different areas that these protests occurred in, and the attitudes of the people towards crime within those areas may have differed greatly. The individuals or social groups may not be criminals themselves, but they may still hold deviant attitudes or an acceptance of such attitudes. So you don't have to be a cray in order to admire their behaviour, according to this theory. This is quite interesting in terrorism, actually, that the government brought in a law which prohibits the glorification of terrorism. But before that, there were actually many imams who, whilst they weren't terrorists themselves in the sense that they wouldn't go out and actually commit acts, they would preach the value or preach the glory of these acts. That is now illegal under British law. So, deviation from dispositional explanations. That's basic theory, and there's a lot more in the guide notes, so make sure you've read that in detail. And read around it as well. Sutherland's an interesting character. Deviation from dispositional explanations. Then, dispositional is all to do with yourself, and it's largely unchangeable. And many of the theories we looked at so far have been dispositional. So, if we're talking about biology, there's nothing you can do about that. If we're talking about personality, there's very little you can do about that. Well, this brings a new perspective and really takes us away from the blame game of where he's a criminal and that's just the way he is, to he's a criminal because of the environment in which he is actually residing. It explains crime through social interactions, which is what gives it its strength. And it can explain a lot of different types of crime. You know, why is it white-collar criminals don't go around, burglarizing houses? But they do engage in, securities frauds. Doesn't quite make sense. But actually, with this theory, from a biological point of view, it doesn't make sense. From this theory, it does. And it has implications for dealing with crime. So here's an example. This is a potential AO2. Babyface Menace was hit with an ASBO, preventing him from hanging around with his younger brothers. These three created this sort of trio of hell where they terrorized local residents. Interestingly, this was done partly to break up the association of these three mischievous individuals, but it was also done from a rehabilitation point of view, so that merely by not associating with his two younger brothers who also had these pro-crime attitudes, antisocial attitudes, this would prevent him from developing any further criminal behaviour, potentially. And it's worth noting with drug use, sorry, I'm just off the top of my head, it's worth noticing with drug use, one of the key factors that often results in relapse in drug addiction is returning to the same social environment in which that drug addiction occurred. Very interesting classical conditioning explanation there. So is there evidence for it? Well, Osborne and West, they found that a father in a family where the father had a criminal conviction, 40% sorry, that's a typo. So it's Osborne and West found that where a father in a family had a criminal conviction, 40% of the sons also had committed a crime by the age of 18, compared to 30% of sons from non-criminal fathers. This is huge. This would imply that because the child is associating from his parents, it's getting this pro-crime. If you see your dad taking drugs, then you start to learn that drugs are okay, or you see your dad engaging in violence, you learn that sort of violence is okay. And because we talked about frequency and duration, length and stuff like that, spending time with your father, obviously you're going to come in frequent contact with your family and for extended periods of time. So this is potentially supportive of differential association. However, you could argue it on the contrary, that this could be explained just as well through genetics. You share the same genes as your father in most cases, so you could have inherited some dysfunctional gene. Akers et al. Looked at 2,500 male-female adolescents and surveyed them, found differential association and reinforcement accounted for about 68% of the variance in drug use, specifically marijuana, 55% in alcohol. So it's not 100%, so we can't say differential association, i.e. hanging around with other people who also smoke. Weed is what causes you to start smoking it, but it's a big part of it. A big part of it. Other parts may be, I think, personality, theory, biology, and some sort of complex mix. Causation versus correlation, though, we come across this one constantly. It may not be that hanging around with criminals makes you a criminal. It may be that you have deviant attitudes to begin with, and therefore you seek out others with deviant attitudes. I always find it interesting when we look at students who enter the sixth form from outside schools. They gravitate towards certain people. Why? Are they, adopted into that group and then changed, or are they actually seeking out people who are similar to themselves? We all like people like ourselves because we like ourselves so much. So this could be a correlation versus causation issue. It's also difficult to isolate inheritance. If you take 65% of boys with a convicted father will go on to offend themselves, according to UK Justice. Is this differential association, learning pro-crime attitudes, or is this genetics at work? It's difficult to isolate it too. Different types of crimes. One of its strengths is that it can explain different types of crime, like white-collar crime, but one of its limitations is impulsive crimes, such as rape. And there is an argument to be made that you may learn, for example, misogynistic attitudes towards women from differential association. But so horrific is that crime, so frowned is not the right word, so abhorred is it in society, or sexual crimes against children, for example. These are a bit more difficult to explain using differential association than something like theft. And of course, things like serial killing is almost impossible to explain. However, this is not necessarily criticism. The majority of crimes are actually petty crimes. There's only 500 homicides roughly a year. Compare that to around 400,000 burglaries. Which is not a petty crime, but it's a less severe crime. So actually, this is quite a valuable theory for things like burglary. And it may matter because the majority of crime tend to be of that nature. Can I explain roughly why 40% of crime is committed by people under the age of 21? Why young people committing a disproportionate amount of crime? Let's assume they don't start their criminal careers until they're sort of 15, 16 in many cases. You're still looking at sort of 6 years. Within a 6-year period, 40% of all crime is being committed. This can't really be explained through differential association, because if we're surrounded by criminals, we'll continue to be surrounded by criminals later in life. These young kids tend not to be. Isaac can explain this through arousal seeking. So our desire for novel stimuli and high arousal is higher when we're younger, and this tails off. For men, testosterone drops dramatically as they get older, but it drops really dramatically when you have a kid. So So you have this sort of testosterone, dump, and that levels a lot of guys out. So maybe one way of doing that is to get criminals to raise their children. Explanatory power, differential association theory can explain crime in a variety of social contexts. So we talked about white-collar crime. They don't tend to be involved in armed robbery so much, just digital robbery. And difficult in testing. How do you test the strength of different people's influence on you? So, if you've got a friend who has pro-crime attitudes, but your parents are against it, how does that interact? Sutherland argues that when the numbers of pro-crime attitudes outnumber anti-crime, that's when crime will ensue. But that's a pretty reductionist approach, and it ignores the fact that actually some people's opinions matter more than others. We conform more to peers than we do to parents and so forth. And biological factors. So obviously you're a mixture of somewhat both, biology, personality, environment, the whole shebang. Farrington et al., 411 males surveyed officially recorded crimes and self-report. 41% had a conviction between the age of, that's not one, that's supposed to be 15 and 50, I think. Risk factors they found were multitudes. So it wasn't just differential association. It was a mix of biology, environment, arousal, low school attainment, poverty, you name it. So it's all these factors feeding in. So differential association theory on its own is not a full explanation of criminal behavior. So let's bring it all together. Differential association plays some role, I suspect, in criminal behaviour, certainly in things like recidivism. And one example of how this is actually being used to improve the lives of criminals, or actually reduce recidivism, can be seen in this short clip. Have a watch and let me know, or have a think about DAT as we're going through it.
New programs are helping keep the streets of Josephine County safer.
A jail bed contract between Josephine and Jackson counties ended this past summer. The services for inmates and people trying to turn their lives around is our top story tonight at 6. A secure treatment program launched back in August in the Josephine County Jail. At the same time, an agreement with Jackson County expired, which allowed Josephine County inmates to be put behind bars in Jackson County if there were not enough beds. This new program provides cognitive behavioral therapy to 10 inmates within the Josephine County Jail.
A lot of these folks that are traditionally within the jail structure, they're just warehoused with a bunch of other criminals that have antisocial patterns, antisocial language, and pro-criminal attitudes.
Josephine Community Corrections' goal is to get inmates into a positive atmosphere with people wanting to turn their lives around in order for them to be good members of society when they get out of lockup. Secure Treatment Program goes beyond what happens in jail with the help of state justice reinvestment funding.
And News 10's Justin Matthews caught up with some people who are turning their lives around with the help of that funding. He shows us their journey.
Sean Johnson is getting ready for his new job at a gas station.
I'm trying to turn my life around, man. I don't want to be a loser, you know what I mean?
He's turning his life around after about 13 years of alcohol and drug abuse. This is a new life for him after recently getting out of prison, which he's called home for the past 3 years.
So we're really trying to, change our lives. We don't want to live like that anymore.
Johnson, along with his neighbor Jeff Prowell, found housing through a local nonprofit organization called Welcome Home Oregon.
I don't know where I'd be. I hate to even think of where I would be if not for this.
Right, so here we go, removing prisoners from a criminal associative environment, getting them away from people with pro-crime attitudes. I really like the idea of criminal language. Yeah, using criminal language regularly is a form of reinforcement potentially of criminal behaviour. Reducing associations with criminals. Offenders opt in for the program, so they are self-selecting and they have that desire, and they'll start to associate with other people who want to get out of that life of crime. The housing was getting them away from their old environments, and work program increasing association with non-offenders. So differential association can work both ways. The idea is you take a problem individual and you put them around with healthy role models who are normal and law-abiding and have anti-crime attitudes, and hopefully they will develop out of that. This sort of approach to treating offenders, though, is very costly, so it's probably not useful on a wide scale. Does prison work? Well, we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we get to custodial sentencing. But just to summarise, we've looked at differential association theory, sociological theory of explaining crime. It focuses on interactions with peer and family, learned through reinforcement based on attitudes towards crime. What some of the strengths are, it shifts from dispositional to situational, which means we can change it, can explain different types of crime, there's some evidence, there's some counter evidence, and ultimately it's likely to be a complex interaction. Now, we haven't talked about the IDAs, but obviously you've got your culture bias, which may be an issue, gender bias. There's going to be things like free will and determinism. Just because you hang around with a bunch of criminals, does it mean that you are determined to become a criminal yourself? Well, Sutherland says yes, if the number of pro-crime attitudes outnumbers the anti-crime, but that ignores individual free will and so forth. Scientific is a scientifically testable theory. Consider nomothetic versus idiographic and all that good stuff. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the description or email me. Bye-bye.